Hello and welcome to the 37th episode of the English Sovereigns podcast series. The subject of today's podcast is one of our three Yorkist kings, Edward IV. Edward was known to be charming, dashing, handsome, warrior-like. He was very tall at 6'4", so he was also quite imposing. And generally, I would say he wasn't a bad king per se, but some of his choices were quite questionable and led to, I think, eventually the Yorkist downfall in 1485. So, a bit about his background. His father was Richard of York, who was one of the prime instigators of the War of the Roses because he'd been invited to become the Lord Protector in, I think, 1453, when Henry VI went catatonic after the loss of Gascony, which was, I think, one of England's prized possessions in France. They'd had it for 300 years. So Richard became the Lord Protector, but then Henry got better, and I think there was toing and froing about who really held the power, which eventually broke out into violence in 1458. And though there were good results for both sides, Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, whilst Henry VI was captured at the Battle of Northampton. Eventually, Margaret of Anjou, who was Henry's wife, who was actually quite a capable military commander in her own right, was decisively defeated at the Battle of Towton in 1461, which has to date been the bloodiest battle in English history. Decisive defeat for her. She went into exile with her son, the Prince of Wales, Edward, who had actually been disinherited as an early result of the war in favour of Richard of York, who was now dead, which meant that Edward was technically the heir. Henry VI was deposed, placed in the Tower, and so Edward became the king. One of Edward's first acts as king was to marry Elizabeth Woodville. Now, Elizabeth Woodville was not daughter of a fancy lord or a princess. She was of quite low birth. She was the daughter of a Lancastrian knight, I believe, and Edward immediately fell for Elizabeth when Elizabeth was petitioning for some land rights off of Edward. Edward's way of showing his affection, firstly, was to proposition Elizabeth and basically wanted to rape her, but Elizabeth was quite canny and she took out a knife and said, "I will not oblige you unless you ask me to marry you," and Edward asked her to marry. And so they did marry, but they kept the marriage a secret until 1467, because I don't think Edward wanted Richard of Warwick to know. But when he eventually found out, he was pretty angry because he wanted Edward to shore up foreign alliances. I think he preferred a French alliance, whilst Edward preferred a Burgundian alliance. It might be the other way around, I can't quite remember. And so that was that, and things came to a head in 1470, so Richard of Warwick decided to leave and go into communication and cahoots with Margaret of Anjou to bring Henry back on the throne because he'd just lost faith in Edward's capacity to govern. And eventually there was a rebellion in 1470 organised by Richard and Margaret, and Henry was restored to the throne for, I think, a year in 1470. Edward went back into exile but then soon returned and managed to take the throne back. Things coming to a head at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Richard of Warwick was killed. Edward, the Prince of Wales, the Henry VI's son, was killed too. Henry VI was replaced in the Tower, but then he himself was murdered in May 1471, which ended that threat, which meant that the sole Lancastrian threat now was Henry Tudor, who, if you remember the Beauforts, who were John of Gaunt's sons, they had continued reproducing, and Henry Tudor was the last heir, so he fled to France. So that was that. However, Elizabeth's marriage to Edward was quite problematic in that the Woodvilles were very, very ambitious, and they were seen as the bad counsellors whispering Henry's and Edward's ear, much like Somerset and the bad counsellors who were whispering in Henry's ear before the Wars of the Roses. And this annoyed George, the Duke of Clarence, who was Edward's younger brother, to the point where Edward was much more ruthless than he was in his first reign, and decided to execute George, the Duke of Clarence. It's actually through George, the Duke of Clarence, that some people argue that the true-born King of England exists, because they think the Tudors are illegitimate, and therefore the current Queen, is illegitimate, and that actual King of England is living in a ranch in Australia somewhere, as that's how the line has gone, although not many people argue that because it's a bit stupid. But there we go, that is that. One thing I did find quite interesting actually about Edward's reign was that after becoming king for the second time, he hired Sir John Fortescue, who had written a few constitutional analytical papers stating about how the French king had the absolute untrammeled right to tax his subjects without consulting any kind of parliament, which kept the poor eternally poor and the rich eternally rich, whilst in England at least the king had to go through parliament to raise taxes, and therefore some degree of liberty was guaranteed. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything, say, like today, but there was some degree of English personal liberty, which is later romanticised by Whigs. But Edward put him in the council, despite being a massive Lancastrian, John Fortescue. He was put in the council, and Edward had to try and become rich himself without oppressing the people. So he actually, George Duke of Clarence's death was quite beneficial, so he just took all his land, increased his income. He wanted to be seen as the most prestigious monarch in Europe, which meant spending a lot of money. And he didn't really lead the country in the best of shape when he died of a fever in, I think, April 1483. He'd been fishing on the River Thames. I think Edward's reign, again, like with a lot of these kings, it's actually more interesting to see how they came to the throne rather than what they did. I think there were famines and bullions like there are in many of the reigns that we see. But Edward, I don't think, ranks too highly among the kings. He's probably somewhere in the middle. But he clearly achieved quite a lot in becoming king. It's just a shame, I guess, his dynasty didn't really last. But that is that. I'll see you for the next episode, which will be 38 and 39 put together in the form of Edward V and Richard III.